Hey everyone, welcome back to another Thomas Wooden Railway discussion. The previous video that I just uploaded was on the Nafford Express coach, and it was a re-review in the sorts because I had already uploaded a Thomas Wooden Railway discussion of that item, but it was like 9 years ago and some things had changed, and I obviously had some new versions of the coach that I wanted to show off. And so the same thing applies here. That was the very first Thomas Wooden Railway discussion that I uploaded back in 2009, and the second Thomas Wooden Railway discussion that I uploaded like on the same day was a review or like a analysis or critique of this White Roof Rusty from 1998. And the reason I did a video on this is because at the time I had a normal black roof Rusty, which was considered normal and not rare, whereas the white roof Rusty, I think still to this day, is considered an anomaly. Even though it was produced for a couple of years, the black roof version is much easier to find compared to the white roof version. So since that video, I have accumulated a number of different Rusty models that I want to go through and compare and contrast. Rusty is a very interesting character because it's like Mattel is pushing Rusty to be almost the face of the narrow gauge railway. I think it's kind of a contest between him and Victor right now. And that's sort of weird to me because the narrow gauge railway has always been like Scarloey or Rheneas's railway, so I don't know. We're kind of in an interesting time where Rusty and Victor are getting a lot of merchandise, even though they aren't like what I would consider to be the most common or well-known characters from that railway. So let's take a trip back in time to the very first version of Rusty that was produced. This version of Rusty is different to the one I just showed you, partly because the face is a lot smaller. This one has flat magnets. I'm guessing it's from 1990. Oh, there's no date on the bottom. So I'm guessing this is from 1993, 1994, but like I said, it has flat magnets. It has this little, I don't know, ledge on the background that people call like a widow's peak, which if you Google widow's peak, you'll kind of understand why people call that, but it's just like a very weird design, whereas you could have made the back of the cab like flush here. We have this little edge for some reason. So Rusty here looks very much like he does in Season 4 and parts of Season 5 of Thomas and Friends. If you go back and watch episodes from that era, specifically, I don't know, let's say like Rusty to the Rescue, Rusty and the Boulder is a bit of a weird one because they switch Rusty's model around in that episode. But with Season 4 of Thomas and Friends, they used, small gauge engines to represent the narrow gauge engines, and then in later seasons they actually made them the same size as Thomas and the standard gauge engines, but then they had to make bigger versions of Thomas and his friends so that they would look small by comparison. It's really weird. But the cool feature with Rusty here is that his face is really small and that it's elevated. Whereas you're going to see here in just a little bit, Rusty's face is going to enlarge by quite a bit and it's going to move around some. So the design here on Rusty is more of it's orange, but it's like a tangish orange, if that makes sense. It's not bright orange like he turns out being. It's a duller color. And somewhere along the line, we've just gradually turned him into like this bright orange pumpkin almost. So there's two metal pieces that I'm guessing are nails at the top here. I'm guessing they actually have a purpose. We have this cylinder shape back here that I'm guessing the nail goes all the way through and embeds it and connects it to this main wooden body here. But it also adds as just sort of some minor detailing there. So Rusty's face is actually really good too. In fact, I consider it to be a pretty close copy to what Rusty's face from Season 4 looks like. And the position and the shape of the face looks weird nowadays, but back then, when this was released and when Season 4 came out, that's what Rusty looked like. I don't understand this small gap there. It looks like a tooth is missing. It's sort of a reverse widow's peak because on the back here we have this. So you'd think if we take that piece and stick it in there, we'd fill the hole or the gap. But I don't know why that's there. But anyway, Rusty looks really good. And there's not a whole lot of complaints with this model, considering it's very accurate to what was seen on TV at the time. Now, this version of Rusty is a bit tricky to find. I got really lucky. I found this one on eBay. It was a buy it now auction for like $6. The seller didn't really know what he was selling, and I'm not saying this version is extremely rare and needs to be jacked up in price, but out of all the versions of Rusty I'm going to show you, this is probably the rarest or the hardest to find, just because it's older, and as time goes on, a lot of these get thrown away or broken apart, and so they just become rare because they're harder to find in one piece. So that's the first version of Rusty. I have showed off this second version of Rusty here, and you're going to notice some similarities and some changes. Rusty's face in size has not increased much. It's maybe a little bit bigger. However, the area surrounding Rusty's face is much, much bigger. It looks like an afro to me, or looks like some crazy hairdo. I don't know why this was done. It's not like I think they had issues with making this version of Rusty. I think it's more to sort of, I guess, make it look like what it looked like at TV or on TV at the time. But yeah, this is where Rusty's shape starts to go a little bit awry, in my opinion. I think he's actually a darker shade of orange. Yeah, way darker shade of orange in this version than in the previous version. So you're going to notice Rusty turns bright orange here a couple of engines down the evolution line. But here it's actually a very dull brown color. It's not orange, he's actually brown. He still has the white roof, which just makes him stand out. And he still has the widow's peak, and I'm positive this is dated, 1998 on the bottom there. So still no name. Whereas I got this one used off of eBay. I got this one new off of eBay back in 2008, I want to say. Rusty's face is a little bit crooked. That doesn't really bother me because I don't use him in any major videos or anything like that. But considering, I don't think Rusty ever had a white roof in the TV series, so it's just very peculiar that they gave him one here. But anyway, that's the second version of Rusty that I want to say it was sold much longer than that version. But it's still not the most common version of Rusty, I would say, either. In fact, the most common version is the one you see here, which I used in my series for a number of years. This version of Rusty, I want to say, was sold from like early 2000s through 2011. It was sold for a really long time. Rusty wasn't sold individually for a long time, however. He was sold with the construction cars, and then he was included in a couple of packs, like the narrow gauge engines pack. And so I don't believe this version of Rusty, off the top of my head, I could be totally wrong. I don't believe this version of Rusty was ever sold by itself, and if it was, certainly wasn't mass produced. But the one thing right away you'll notice here is that Rusty's face is still the same, but this black area around where his face is has actually grown just a tiny bit. They're about even right there. And you can see it's just a little bit bigger and a little bit wider. So we're increasing that face area for some reason. I should have noted this earlier. Rusty is not a symmetrical engine in design. The left side has a window for like his driver, and then the right side has an opening specific, you'd think, where the driver would climb in. So I should have noted that earlier, because Rusty is one of the few engines that is not symmetrical to both sides. Now Rusty is starting to turn more orange. His name has also changed, as well as the number. It's much smaller than it was previously, and if we bring up this version, okay, those two versions are relatively the same. He has those 4 dots, which are something train related, but I don't know what they are off the top of my head, but those have also changed design as well. But we still have the 2 nails here. That one goes through this cylinder shape, and then one goes through I guess the front area where his face is. So this is by far the most common version of Rusty. We finally have a name on the bottom, and I want to say, oh, this is actually dated 2001. A lot of these are going to be dated 2003, because after 2003 everything was dated 2003. It's really weird. So this is actually from 2001. I was expecting it to be from 2003, but this came with the 3-pack known as, I think it was called the Rusty and the Construction Cars, hopefully. And at the time, that was the only way to buy Rusty. So that, I think, is arguably the most common version of Rusty. That was sold for over 10 years. And then we get this version of Rusty, which is highly detailed, but there are some changes. Now, this is the Tomy version, as you see on the bottom here, that was only sold in 2012, because what happened to Learning Curve is that Learning Curve was no longer interested in making the Thomas Wooden Railway toys. And so they were then bought by Tomy, and Tomy made the toys for 1 year. And then they were sold to Mattel, which is who currently owns them. So this version of Rusty is only from 2012. I still want to say it's dated 2003. Yeah, it still is. But if we were to call these, like, you know, the early small version of Rusty, and then the white roof Rusty, and then like the normal classic Rusty, this is sort of the Tomy Rusty. And like I said, it has a lot of detail, but there are some significant changes. For some reason, the version that I bought had this sort of paint air here, which doesn't make it look too good, but it doesn't really bother me because I don't use this version of Rusty at all. He only appears in a video like this or in my collection video. So the big change here is Rusty's color has actually faded a tiny bit. His number has been moved up. He has a little bit more of a detail right there. I don't know what that is. The white outline around these circles is gone. The area for his driver to, I guess, like the window hole, or it looks like a porthole on a ship, honestly, is different. The face is much bigger, so it's starting to fit in more proportionally than this Rusty right here. And actually, this face area has actually shrunk quite a bit. And something I forgot to mention, compared to this Rusty has a red running board, which is then continued on to this new version, the Tomy version of Rusty, but it's much darker. We flip it over to the side here, pretty much what we just looked at. But for the first time, Rusty has some details on his back. Now, this is a really important detail in my opinion, because in Rusty's, arguably his most famous episode, Rusty and the Boulder, I think there's a shot where the driver looks out the rear window and he sees Boulder rolling towards them. So that is just a really nice addition, and they've also included a tail lamp, which is really, really nice. So even though these Tomy models were only sold for about a year, they are pretty impressive. I'm not a big fan of the face, however. It sticks out quite a bit. If you compare it to the old Rusty's face, it's very thick. And I'm not totally on board with the design here. So this is from 2012, which means we are in the process of seeing Blue Mountain Mystery, which is when the narrow gauge engines returned to television and returned to the series for the first time. So Rusty had a much bigger face, but I'm just not a big fan of the expression. But he still has those two classic nails. However, one of them is still clear, and this other one looks like it's rusted, but I think that's just the way it is. It's just like a brown or golden nail. Those are still there. So I guess that style of Rusty has really lasted for a long time. And we actually have a red detailing on the back there that we did not have on the previous version. So considering Rusty stayed the same for a really long time, this Tomy version actually upgraded quite a number of things. Most notably the face and this rear window detailing as well. So that Rusty was only around for like a year or so. And then we were introduced to this version of Rusty, which is like the Mattel version that I currently use in my series. And it has a lot more details than the previous version of Rusty as well. So, first off, the porthole, or the side window, has shrunk down quite a bit. We now have these extra, looks like rivets, going along the side there. Some more detailing here. It looks like these are vents for like the diesel engine. Unfortunately, after all this time, those little nails are gone. And one of them's been replaced by just a gold circle. The face is also really, really big. Again, whatever you may think about Rusty's face size and what it should look like, at least these two are starting to look more, I guess, proportional, whereas this version, it was a super small Rusty face with this big area that was like, why do we need that big area there? So, whereas this version of Rusty really didn't look like, or the front of it really didn't look like Rusty from the TV series or from Blue Mountain Mystery, this version of Rusty does. Because Rusty all of a sudden has a very big face that covers the entire front of his body. So, very quickly, look at how much bigger Rusty's face is. I mean, we are almost looking at like a 40%, 30-40% increase in face size there. Around that much. That's pretty incredible. My Rusty's a little bit weird. His eyes usually aren't supposed to be that, like, I don't know, scary looking, if you want to call it, but for some reason his pupils are just really small. He still has a lot of detail here, but what's really interesting is we actually lost the detailing on the back, which is a shame because this detailing was really nice. And like I said, how this version of Rusty, the color was a lot duller than that version. Well, now we are into full-blown pumpkin mode for Rusty. He is just bright orange. And compared to this version, which was definitely brown or tan, there's a definite paint difference there. So this is the current version of Rusty that I use in my series. I think it's a really good version. I just wish it had, if I could take, one thing from the previous Tomy version, I would really want this back detailing here because people who, those Tomy engines are really weird. They were only made for a year. Not a whole lot of them exist, but one thing Tomy did really well is they had a lot of details on them. Like I said, I'm not a big fan of the face. I like this face better even though it's bigger, but at least it looks like Rusty from the TV series. So we actually have one more version of Rusty that I'm going to show off here. Close your eyes if you're not a fan of the Thomas Wood products. This is the current version of Rusty that is sold in stores, and the detailing has completely diminished. He's still orange, but he's more brown than orange because he's totally not painted. Just everything has been, taken back. It's a definite step backwards, regardless. His face, I guess the best way to describe his face is it's cute, and he has like this little triangle arc at the bottom or angle, whereas here he didn't have that. But it looks like he also has a funnel here. So we've lost this screw detail that was here for a long time, and then on this version it's just been replaced by a gold circle, and now we've completely lost any sense of color to that part, and it literally looks like a funnel. But I'm pretty sure Rusty doesn't have a funnel if he's a diesel, so I really don't get that. But anyway, I guess the only redeeming part about Rusty here is that he has some buffers for once. He has never had buffers. He's had a painted buffer beam, but he's never had painted buffers, if you can call that painted. And that's about all I can say about this version of Rusty here. So remarkably, it's hard to believe, over the years, we have gotten 6 different versions of Rusty, which is surprising because in my mind, Rusty is not the, like the spokesperson or the a good representation of the narrow gauge railway, not because he's a bad character or anything, but just because of when I think of the Skarloey Railway, I think of Skarloey and Rheneas. I don't think of Rusty, and I especially don't think of Victor. But when you take a look at Mattel's recent merchandise, they've made, I guess, Rusty doesn't have an Adventures version, and he doesn't have a Trackmaster version recently, but Victor has, he has a Wood version, he has a Adventures, and he has a Trackmaster version. And considering Victor is a relatively new character, he was introduced in 2009 with Hero of the Rails, I don't think he's a good representation of the Skarloey Railway, and I really don't think Rusty is either. However, it seems as though Mattel's not super interested in producing any merchandise of Rheneas or Skarloey or even Sir Handel or Peter Sam or even Duncan, so it looks like we're going to be stuck with these two representing the Skarloey Railway for quite some time. which, you know, it's not a bad thing if it's Rusty. Victor, I don't really understand. I think they're just pushing really hard to get Victor out there and sell a lot of merchandise of him. But Rusty's okay because at least he's a Railway series character. But fun fact, in the Railway series, he was actually painted black. For some reason, they changed him to orange. So I guess he would stand out more and look like a pumpkin. So Rusty isn't the worst representation of the narrow gauge railway, but at the same time, he's not the best, because there's a reason the narrow gauge railway is called the Skarloey Railway. It's because Skarloey and Rheneas were the first two engines. So I guess I'll just leave it at that. It's pretty crazy how many versions of Rusty we've gotten, because I don't consider him to be a main character. And for all those years, the narrow gauge engines didn't get very many episodes, and they were missing from the TV series for a really long time. And so during that time, I mean, they have not stopped producing Rusty merchandise since he was introduced in the early 90s, which is really interesting. I mean, it's gone from this to this to this. It was this for a really long time. It was this for a year. It's been like this for 3 or 4 years, and now it's this. So apparently Rusty sells, maybe because it's his color, maybe because, you know, people really like Rusty. I think he's a good character. You know, he's kind of like an Edward character. You know, he doesn't really get into trouble or anything like that. So apparently Rusty is popular enough so that he still sells, but nonetheless, he's still a very interesting character when you come down to it, and I don't know why he gets so much merchandise. But nonetheless, you've been clearly able to see how Rusty has changed over the years, especially his face. It's gone from something super, super tiny to something super, super big, which is bizarre. But, you know, these engines, they change and evolve as the TV series goes on, and I guess that's just how it goes. So anyway, I want to thank you guys so much for watching. I was a bit surprised as to how many versions of Rusty there were. It just kind of blew me away. It's like, wow, you know, at the time when I was planning this video, I didn't have the wood version. And I'm thinking 5 versions of Rusty is still impressive. But anyway, we have the 6th wood version here. So we can kind of see the evolution and then the devolution or de-evolution as we get over here. But anyway, I'll leave it at that. Thank you all so much for watching, and I really appreciate the support, and I hope you guys have a great day.